Chapter 1. The Weight of Whispers. The scent of bloodroot and willow bark clung to Selene's hands, a familiar perfume that did little to soothe the knot in her stomach. Just like every other day in the healing den, she worked in a bubble of silence. Her fingers moved with a practiced grace, crushing the herbs into a dark, fragrant paste. The poultice was perfect. It would draw the fever from the young pup's body before nightfall, a fact she knew with a certainty that was bone deep. It was a gift, a whisper of knowledge from her mother's line that she never spoke of. No one would believe her anyway. She offered the small wooden bowl to Alara, the pack's head healer. The older wolf took it without a word, her lips a thin, unimpressed line. "We'll see if this works," Alara muttered, turning away. The dismissal, casual and sharp, was a stone added to a pile already too heavy to carry. Selene's shoulders slumped. She meticulously cleaned her workstation, her movements small and contained. She had learned long ago that taking up too much space was a sin for the daughter of a traitor. This quiet torment was her reality, because her father, a beta who had sworn a blood oath, had betrayed their alpha years ago. He had sold secrets, broken faith, and been exiled, leaving Selene to inherit the full weight of his shame. She fought it the only way she knew how, with perfection. She was the first to rise, the last to rest. Her remedies were flawless. Her knowledge of the forest's hidden cures was unmatched. It didn't matter. To the pack, she was not Selene the healer. She was only ever the disgraced daughter, a ghost haunting the edges of their society. As she stepped out of the den, the crisp autumn air did nothing to clear the fog in her mind. The stairs followed her. The whispers slithered behind her like snakes in the grass. She hated the whispers, the stares, the pity. A tremor of rage, hot and useless, went through her. She had been finding blighted herbs at the edge of the territory for weeks, plants that were twisted and sick with a strange, dark rot. She had tried to warn Alara, but the healer had waved her off, claiming it was just an early frost. Selene knew better. Something was wrong with the land. Something no one else seemed to care about. Suddenly, a sound cut through the murmuring pack. A low, resonant blast from a ceremonial horn echoed from the great ridge. It was a call that every wolf knew, a summons that vibrated with ancient tradition and primal urgency. Selene froze, the blood draining from her face. 1 year. It had been 1 whole year. She had almost let herself forget. The alpha's voice boomed across the clearing, strong and clear. "Let every member of the Silver Moon pack hear. In 1 week's time, we celebrate the mating ceremony." Cheers erupted. Wolves howled, their voices rising in a joyous chorus. But for Selene, the sound was a death knell. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. 1 week, 7 days until she would be forced to stand on the ceremonial stage, alone, again. The memory of last year, of every year before, crashed over her. The humiliation, the sneers, the confirmation of the one truth she could never escape. Unwanted. The world narrowed to a single terrifying point, and all she could think was that she would rather die than live through it one more time. The need for an escape, any escape, became a fire in her blood. Chapter 2. A Desperate Bargain. Following the crushing announcement, Selene's small room felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. The scent of dried lavender and chamomile hanging from the rafters did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Here, alone, she was not the traitor's daughter. She was just Selene, a woman whose true passion lay not in poultices, but in ink. On the small wooden table, a leather-bound journal was open. Its pages were filled with detailed, elegant sketches of herbs, their root systems, their flowering patterns, and notes on their hidden properties. Remedies no one had ever seen. Magic no one would ever acknowledge. A soft knock at the door made her jump. She quickly closed the journal, her secret world hidden once more. "Come in." Lyra, her only friend, slipped inside. She was a small omega with kind eyes, and a smile that had weathered years of the pack's cruelty alongside Selene. She held 2 steaming mugs. "Thought you might need this." Selene took the mug of mint tea, her hands trembling. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Lyra said softly, her gaze full of a sorrow that mirrored Selene's own. "I heard the announcement. I'm so sorry, Sel." Tears pricked Selene's eyes. She hated them, hated the weakness. "It's fine." "No, it's not," Lyra insisted, sitting on the edge of the cot. "It's cruel. Last year was unbearable. I saw Cale and his friends making bets on how long you'd last before you ran off the stage." The memory, sharp and brutal, made Selene flinch. She remembered the feeling of 1,000 eyes on her, the heat of her shame, the cold finality of standing there as every other wolf found a partner. She had lasted 3 minutes before fleeing into the forest, the sound of their laughter chasing her. "I can't do it again, Lyra," she whispered, the words raw. "I can't." Lyra was quiet for a long moment, stirring her tea. Then she looked up, a strange, hesitant light in her eyes. "What if you didn't have to? What if you weren't alone?" Selene gave a bitter laugh. "Who would stand with me? No one would risk the pack's judgment." "No one from our pack," Lyra said slowly, choosing her words with care. "But what if you just hired someone, for the night?" The suggestion hung in the air, so absurd, so utterly insane, that Selene just stared. "Hired someone? Like a mercenary? To be my what? My fake mate?" The idea was repellent. It was a lie, a pathetic charade. She refused at first, because the thought felt like a final admission that she was truly, fundamentally unwanted. A product to be bought, not a person to be chosen. "Just for one night, Sel," Lyra pressed, her voice urgent. "My cousin trades with some of the rogues and loners who pass through the outer territories. He knows a wolf, new to the area, strong. He keeps to himself, but he needs coin. No one would know him. You would just walk onto the stage with him, stand there until the ceremony is over, and then he'd be gone. No more whispers, no more bets." Was this really all she was worth? A handful of coins for a night of pretend? The shame of it warred with the stark terror of the alternative. Another year of public disgrace. Another confirmation of her worthlessness. The humiliation felt like a physical thing, a hand closing around her throat. The lie was ugly, but the truth was unbearable. The lie was a shield. The truth was a killing blow. Slowly, numbly, Selene reached under her cot and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. It held the few coins she had saved over years of thankless work, her entire fortune. She poured them into her palm. They felt cold, insignificant. She looked at Lyra, her eyes hollow. "Tell your cousin I'll pay." The decision settled in her gut, a cold, hard knot of desperation and self-loathing. The bargain was struck. Chapter 3. The Scent of a Storm. The week leading to the ceremony crawled by, each day a new turn of a screw tightening the anxiety in Selene's chest. Now, the night was here. The air in the great clearing thrummed with a nervous energy that was almost electric. Pine-fed torches hissed and popped, casting long dancing shadows that writhed like living things. The smell of roasting boar and spiced cider mingled with the damp, earthy scent of the pack. It was a perfume of celebration, but for Selene it smelled only of dread. Her stomach churned. The simple dress she wore felt like a costume, the leather too stiff, the fabric too rough. She stood near the edge of the crowd, trying to make herself small, trying to breathe. Where was he? Lyra had confirmed the arrangement. A tall rogue with dark hair, a scar by his left eye, would meet her by the ancient oak. He was late. Every passing minute felt like a grain of sand in an hourglass that was about to run out. Her gaze scanned the shifting bodies, the laughing faces, searching for someone who looked like a man for hire. Everyone seemed to belong. Everyone but her. Look what the shadows dragged in. The voice was a low sneer, thick with arrogance. Kale. He swaggered past, his two cronies flanking him. He didn't even look at her, but the words were arrows aimed right at her heart. Trying to find a mate, traitor's spawn? You'd have better luck begging a hunter for a quick death. His friends snickered. The casual cruelty of it stole the air from her lungs. This was why she had done it. This was the poison she was trying to escape. Her hands clenched into fists. She wouldn't run. Not this time. Just as the rage and despair crested, a change in the atmosphere made the hairs on her arms stand up. The chaotic noise of the crowd seemed to dim, to draw back from one specific point. A space had cleared near the edge of the firelight, and in it stood a man she had never seen before. He was no hired rogue. Rogues were lean, hungry, their edges frayed by a hard life. This wolf was different. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He was a shadow in the corner, a stillness in the chaos, a silence that was louder than every cheer. His hair was as black as a starless night, and even from a distance she could feel the searing intensity of his gaze as he surveyed the pack. She felt a tremor of fear because he radiated an authority that no mere wanderer should possess. He felt like a storm on the horizon, a promise of violence and power. Her heart hammered against her ribs. That can't be him. He was too much. But he was alone, and he was new. Her anxiety spiked. The first ceremonial drum began to beat a slow, deep rhythm. The alpha was moving toward the stage. Time was up. Her hired date wasn't coming. Panic, pure and absolute, began to drown her. But then the stranger moved. He didn't walk so much as flow through the crowd, a predator parting a herd. And he was moving in her direction. Chapter 4. A reckless accusation. That final deep beat of the ceremonial drum was not just a sound, it was a judgment. It echoed the frantic thumping in Selene's own chest, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated panic. The alpha was on the stage now, his arms raised to begin the rites. All around her, wolves began to pair off, hands finding hands, eyes finding eyes. It was happening. Time had run out. Her hired date was gone, a ghost who had never existed, and she was left standing on the edge of her own personal cliff. The memory of Kale's sneer was a fresh wound, hot and stinging, begging a hunter for a quick death. The thought of facing that alone, of seeing that triumphant smirk on his face as she stood isolated for all to see, was an agony she refused to endure. She had wanted a shield, a shadow, a simple lie. Anything was better than the crushing weight of the truth. Her desperation was a wild thing, clawing its way up her throat. She had to do something, anything. Her eyes locked on the stranger, the dark, silent wolf who felt less like a person and more like a force of nature. He was still watching the crowd, his expression unreadable, a mask of cold control. He was her only option, a terrible, reckless, insane option. She approached him because there was simply no other choice left on the board. The decision wasn't a thought. It was an impulse, a final, convulsive act of self-preservation. Every step toward him felt like wading through thick, heavy water. The air grew colder, charged with an energy that seemed to radiate from him alone. He was bigger up close, his presence a solid wall of muscle and shadow. He had to be him. He just had to be. Who else could it be? The thought was a frantic prayer. She reached him just as the alpha began to speak the ancient words of the ceremony. She didn't even give him a chance to look at her properly. The words just came tumbling out, a rushed, angry whisper laced with terror. "You're late." He turned his head slowly, and his eyes, a startling, piercing shade of silver that seemed to glow in the torchlight, finally landed on her. For a moment, she forgot how to breathe. "If you're going to pretend to be my boyfriend," she snapped, her voice trembling despite her best effort to sound commanding, "the least you could do is act interested." The accusation hung in the air between them, a wild, desperate gamble thrown into the face of a predator. She had no idea what he would do. Laugh? Scowl? Deny everything and expose her right there? She braced herself for the impact of her own foolishness, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What had she done? Chapter 5: The Predator's Gaze. In the wake of her desperate accusation, the stranger did not laugh. He didn't scowl. He did nothing she expected. For a fraction of a second, his piercing silver eyes widened, a flicker of something that looked like utter shock, a crack in his icy control. Then, something else shifted. He went unnaturally still, his head tilting just so. He inhaled, a sharp, sudden intake of air, and it was as if the world stopped on that single breath. Selene watched, mesmerized and terrified as his entire demeanor changed. The cold observer vanished. In his place was something else, something primal. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her throat, and a low, almost inaudible sound rumbled in his chest. It wasn't a word. It was the sound of a landslide starting miles away, the feeling of thunder vibrating through the ground. His focus on her was so absolute, so intense, it felt like a physical touch. The air crackled. The scent of pine and cold winter frost that clung to him seemed to intensify, wrapping around her, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt a strange pull toward him, a dizzying, terrifying magnetism that her body seemed to recognize even if her mind was screaming at her to run. She took a half step back, a purely instinctual retreat, but his eyes snapped back to hers, pinning her in place. A slow smirk, sharp and dangerous, spread across his lips. It did not reach his eyes. His eyes burned. "Interested?" he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that sent a shiver racing down her spine. He leaned in closer, his warmth a startling contrast to the cold he projected. His scent was overwhelming now, and a strange weakness bloomed in her limbs. "I'd say I'm far more than interested." The words made no sense. This wasn't the grudging acceptance of a wolf for hire. This was the hungry purr of a predator that had just found its prey. Her mind reeled. Who was this man? This was wrong. All wrong. Her plan had been to control the lie, but in a single instant, she had lost all control. He was the one in charge now, and she had no idea what game he was playing. She opened her mouth to say something, to take it back, to run, but no words came out. Just then, a shadow fell over them. "Well, well." Cale's voice dripped with malice as he and his cronies stepped in front of them, blocking their path. So the little traitor spawn did manage to find someone. "Let me guess. You paid him?" Cale's eyes raked over the stranger, a dismissive sneer on his face. "How much does the daughter of a betrayer cost for a night, rogue?" The insult was a lit match, and Selene suddenly had the horrifying feeling that she was standing next to a barrel of gunpowder. Chapter 6: A Claim of Thunder. That final, ugly question from Kale seemed to suck all the sound from the clearing. It was a direct challenge, not just to her, but to the silent, imposing man at her side. Selene flinched, expecting the stranger to step away, to sever their flimsy, mistaken connection and leave her to the wolves. That was the logical thing to do. That was what a wolf for hire would do. He owed her nothing. Defending her would only draw unwanted attention, and she could see from the coiled tension in his shoulders that he was not a man who enjoyed the spotlight. But he didn't move. He didn't step away. He went rigid. A low growl, deeper and more menacing than any she had ever heard, vibrated through the ground. It wasn't a sound made for Kale. It was a promise of violence meant for the entire world. Selene felt it resonate in her own bones, a primal warning that made her blood run cold with a terror that was entirely new. This was not the anger of a man insulted. This was the fury of a territorial alpha. Before she could process what was happening, his hand shot out and gripped hers. A jolt of pure, unadulterated energy, hot and wild, surged up her arm. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a brand, a statement. He pulled her slightly behind him, a gesture so possessive, so definitive, that it left no room for interpretation. He was shielding her, claiming the space around her as his own. Kale, too stupid to recognize the danger, laughed. "What's wrong, rogue? Cat got your—" He never finished the sentence. The stranger's head snapped up, his silver eyes blazing with a light that was no longer human. They were the eyes of a wolf about to make a kill. When he spoke, his voice was not a murmur. It was a crack of thunder that ripped through the stunned silence of the ceremony, a declaration that stopped hearts. "She's mine." The words were simple, 2 words, but they were imbued with a power, an ancient authority that silenced every whisper, stopped every breath. He took a step forward, pulling Selene with him, his grip on her hand unbreakable. He looked directly at the pack alpha on the stage, then at the sea of shocked faces around them. "My mate." The world tilted on its axis. The air shattered. Mate. The word echoed in the crushing silence, a pronouncement of fate that was both a shock and a sentence. Selene's mind went completely blank. She saw the blood drain from Kyle's face, saw the utter disbelief in the eyes of the pack, saw the alpha on the stage freeze mid-right. She had wanted a lie to hide behind, a quiet, unassuming shield to get her through one night. Instead, this stranger, this terrifying, powerful, impossible stranger, had just chained her to him with the most sacred, unbreakable vow in their entire world. He hadn't just saved her from humiliation. He had thrown her into the heart of a raging inferno. Chapter 7. The Iron Law. The silence that followed his words was a living thing. It was heavier than stone, a crushing weight that pressed down on the entire pack. Selene felt as if she were underwater, the world a distant, blurry mess of gaping mouths and wide, staring eyes. My mate. The 2 words echoed in the void, replaying over and over until they lost all meaning. It was a dream, a nightmare. It couldn't be real. Then, from the ceremonial stage, the alpha finally moved. He descended the stone steps, his face a grim mask of disbelief and duty. He was trailed by the 2 oldest pack elders, their faces etched with the gravity of the situation. They stopped before Selene and the stranger, their gazes moving between the man's iron grip on her hand and the defiant fire in his silver eyes. The world slowly came rushing back in a wave of sound and horror. The whispers had started again, no longer mocking, but frantic and questioning. "You are not of this pack, stranger." The alpha's voice was low, rumbling with authority. "That doesn't matter," the man replied, his voice calm and absolute. The claim was made. It was witnessed. Selene's own voice felt like a shard of glass in her throat. "No, it's a mistake," she choked out, trying to pull her hand free. His grip was unyielding, a cage of warm, strong fingers. "I don't know him." The eldest of the 2 elders, a she-wolf with eyes as pale as the winter moon, looked at Selene with something that was not quite pity. "The bond does not make mistakes, child. A claim made during the sacred ceremony is absolute." She turned her gaze to the alpha. "The law is clear." The alpha nodded, his expression hard. He looked at Selene, his eyes leaving no room for argument. It was not a request, not a suggestion, but a sentence. "You will be quartered together. The law demands a period of seclusion until the bond settles and can be formally recognized." Panic, pure and undiluted, finally broke through Selene's shock. "No, you can't, I won't," she cried, her voice thin and reedy. No one was listening. The stranger was already moving, pulling her along with an irresistible force. The crowd parted for them like a river splitting around a boulder. She could feel their stares on her back, 100 questions burning into her skin. She was no longer the pitiful outcast. She was something else now. A mystery. A prize. A prisoner. He led her away from the firelight, away from the celebration that had become a spectacle of her own making. They walked in a tense silence to a small, isolated lodge reserved for visiting emissaries. It was set back in the pines, far from the others. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and pulled her inside. The door clicked shut behind them. The sound echoed with a terrible finality. They were alone. Chapter 8. A Scent of Solace. The moment that door closed, sealing them in the suffocating quiet of the lodge, a dam of fury broke inside Selene. She ripped her hand from his grasp, the sudden freedom feeling hollow and temporary. She spun to face him, her entire body trembling with a rage born of pure terror. The room was small, lit by a single low-burning lantern that cast flickering shadows on his hard-planed face. He looked like something carved from stone in midnight. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice rising with every word. "What was that? Mate? You have no right." He watched her, his expression unreadable. He showed no surprise, no anger, only a disquieting calm that fueled her own frantic energy. He began to unfasten the leather clasps of his cloak. "My name is Damien." "I don't care what your name is," she shot back, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "You ruined everything. I had a plan, a simple plan, and you—" She gestured wildly, unable to articulate the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe he had created. "Why would you do that?" Cale was a problem, Damien stated simply, draping his dark cloak over a wooden chair. "I solved it." "A problem?" she repeated in disbelief. "He's an arrogant flea. You didn't solve anything. You set my entire life on fire. You have to go back out there and tell them you were wrong. Tell them it was a lie." She had to fix this because her entire life had been a careful balancing act of staying invisible, and he had just shoved her onto center stage. He finally looked at her then, his silver eyes pinning her in place. A shiver of something that was not entirely fear went through her. It was not a lie. The finality in his tone stole her breath. There was no arguing with it. It was a statement of fact, as unmovable as a mountain. Defeated, she sank onto the edge of the small cot, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a cold, hollow dread. He claimed the single chair, leaving the room divided by a chasm of tense silence. Hours passed. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. A strange, deep ache had begun to settle in her chest, a phantom pain that grew with every foot of distance between them. It was a cold, lonely hurt, a physical craving for something. For him. The realization was so horrifying that a choked sob escaped her lips. Her own body was a traitor. Her own instincts were siding with this stranger, this monster who had stolen her life. Damien stood without a word. He walked over to the chair and picked up his heavy cloak. He didn't offer it. He didn't speak. He simply tossed it onto the cot beside her. It landed with a soft thump. The scent of pine and winter frost and wild, clean earth rose from the fabric. It was his scent. Instinctively, desperate for any relief from the gnawing ache, she pulled it toward her. She clutched the dark, heavy wool, burying her face in its folds. Instantly, the ache in her chest began to ease. The cold in her bones receded. Wrapped in his scent, her traitorous body finally found a sliver of peace, and a heavy, dreamless sleep pulled her under. Chapter 9. The Predator's Mercy. Selene woke to the gray light of dawn and a profound sense of dislocation. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then the scent of pine and frost filled her senses, and the memory of the night came crashing back. She was clutching his cloak like a child's blanket. A hot flush of shame went through her. She was in a stranger's lodge. A stranger who called himself her mate. A stranger whose scent was the only reason she had been able to sleep. She sat up, letting the cloak fall away, and the cold ache in her chest immediately returned, a dull, constant reminder of her new reality. Damien was already awake. He stood by the lodge's single window, staring out at the forest, his back to her. He was a formidable silhouette against the pale morning light, his presence dominating the small room. She wondered if he had slept at all. She wondered what he was thinking. Was she a prize to him? A conquest? A mistake he already regretted? the silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. She needed to break it. She refused to be a frightened mouse hiding in his shadow. "I'm not your prisoner," she said, her voice rough with sleep. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp and severe. "I have never said you were." "You don't have to," she retorted, standing up. "You claimed me like a piece of property. You dragged me here against my will. What would you call it?" He turned fully to face her, and his silver eyes held an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, more complex. "I would call it complicated." He took a step toward her. "You think you are weak, healer. You are not." The words surprised her. He had seen her for a single night. How could he possibly know anything about her? "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know that you stand up to wolves who would see you broken," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And I know that you have a fire in you that you try very hard to hide. Let's see it." Before she could react, he lunged, not in an attack, but in a test. She sidestepped instinctively, her healer's knowledge of anatomy giving her a flicker of an advantage. She ducked under his arm, but he was too fast. He spun, catching her off balance, and in a blur of motion, he had her pinned against the rough wooden wall. His body was a wall of heat and muscle against hers. One of his arms was braced by her head, the other hand gently but firmly circling her wrist. She was utterly trapped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the steady beat of his own heart against her chest. His face was inches from hers, his breath warm on her skin. She stared into his silver eyes, expecting to see triumph, a victor's arrogance. Instead, she saw conflict, a storm of warring emotions. "I never—" he started, his voice rough, almost pained. He stopped, shaking his head slightly, as if fighting with himself. "I never thought—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. In that fractured moment, she saw it. The first crack in the armor. This wasn't simple possession. This was just as terrifying and confusing for him as it was for her. He pulled back abruptly, leaving her cold and breathless against the wall. For the first time, she looked at him and saw not just a captor, but a man chained to the same impossible fate she was. Chapter 10. The Friend's Shadow. After the confrontation in the lodge, the days settled into a strange and brittle routine. A fragile truce existed in the space between them, thick with unspoken questions. They shared the small cabin, moving around each other with a careful, deliberate grace. The pack left food at their doorstep, but no one dared to knock. They were an island, isolated by the sheer force of Damien's claim and the pack's bewildered suspicion. The ache of the bond had subsided to a low, constant hum, a silver thread connecting them, but the tension remained. It was in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression a mask of guarded intensity. This new, fragile peace was shattered by a knock on the door. Selene froze, her gaze darting to Damien. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head, but the visitor was persistent. "Selene? It's me, Rhea. Can I come in?" Rhea, the other apprentice from the healing den, the wolf who had always offered a hesitant smile when others offered a sneer. Before Damien could object, Selene opened the door. It felt like a small act of defiance, a way to prove this was not a prison. "Rhea?" Selene said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "Oh, Selene, I was so worried," Rhea gushed, rushing in and pulling her into a hug that felt stiff and awkward. Her eyes, however, were not on Selene. They slid past her, landing on Damien, who stood silent and immovable by the hearth. A flicker of something, curiosity, fear, calculation, passed through them before she quickly looked away. "The whole pack is talking. A rogue claiming you as his mate at the ceremony. It's just unbelievable." "It's been an adjustment," Selene said, her words carefully chosen. Rhea's gaze was sharp, probing. He's so quiet. Is he treating you well? You know, no one knows anything about him. Where did he come from? What is he doing here?" The questions were framed as concern, as friendly chatter. But they felt like a physician's prodding at a fresh wound, each one aimed at a specific, tender spot. They were too precise. Selene felt a sudden chilling instinct, a deep-seated feeling that this was not a friendly visit. She remembered the strange, blighted herbs she'd found near the territory's edge, a puzzle that still worried her. For reasons she couldn't explain, Ria's presence suddenly felt connected to that same feeling of sickness. She deflected the questions with vague answers, her mind racing. This was a test. She was being watched. The conversation was mercifully cut short when Damien moved. He walked to the door and held it open, his silver eyes fixed on Ria. The message was unmistakable. Leave. Ria's friendly facade faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing her features before she masked it with a nervous smile. "Well, I should go. Just be careful, Selene," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She squeezed Selene's arm one last time and then scurried out the door. Damien closed it behind her, the heavy thud echoing in the sudden silence. He turned to Selene, his expression grim. "Do not trust her," he said, his voice a low growl. The warning confirmed the cold dread in Selene's own gut. Something was terribly wrong, and she was standing right in the middle of it. Chapter 11. A Phantom Agony. A few days after Ria's unsettling visit, the fragile peace in the lodge finally snapped. Damien had been restless all morning, pacing the small space like a caged wolf. There was a storm in his eyes, a darkness that Selene was beginning to recognize as the focus of a predator on the hunt. He pulled on his dark cloak, his movements sharp and decisive. "I have to go out," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. A knot of dread tightened in Selene's stomach. "Where?" "It's better if you don't know," he replied, his silver eyes meeting hers. For a moment she saw a flash of regret, of something that looked almost like an apology. "Stay inside, bolt the door." And then he was gone. The silence he left behind was heavy, suffocating. Selene obeyed, sliding the heavy iron bolt across the door, but it did little to make her feel safe. The lodge felt cold without his presence, the low hum of the bond stretching thin and taut like a string pulled to its breaking point. She tried to busy herself by sorting through a pouch of dried herbs, the familiar scents usually a comfort. Today, they did nothing. An hour passed, then another. It happened without any warning. She was standing by the hearth when a searing, white-hot agony erupted in her chest. A scream ripped from her throat as she collapsed, her hands flying to her ribs. It was not her pain. The wound was not on her skin, but the agony was absolute. It was a phantom torment, a fire burning through her from the inside out. Silver. Her mind screamed the word. It was the burn of silver, a poison that ate at a wolf's very essence. Damien. The world dissolved into a red haze of pain. She could feel everything, the shock, the fire, the life draining away from him, and from her. She gasped for breath, her vision tunneling. But through the agony, a strange new sense was screaming at her. The silver thread of the bond was no longer a gentle hum. It was a roaring, blinding beacon of pain, and it was pulling her. It was telling her where he was. She didn't think. She only acted. She scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She grabbed her healer's pouch, her fingers numb and clumsy. Unbolting the door, she burst out of the lodge and into the forest running. She didn't know the path, but she didn't need to. She ran because the pain was a compass, a screaming arrow pointing the way through the dense, unfamiliar woods. Branches whipped at her face, rocks tore at her feet, but she barely felt it. It was nothing compared to the phantom fire in her chest. Deeper and deeper into the forest she ran, guided by an invisible chain of shared agony. The scent of blood finally hit her, thick and metallic on the air, confirming the bond's terrible truth. She stumbled into a hidden ravine, her breath catching on a sob. There he was, sprawled on the ground, his dark cloak stained even darker with blood. A wicked-looking blade, its edge gleaming with a sick, silvery sheen, lay discarded nearby. His eyes were closed. He was utterly, terrifyingly still. Chapter 12. A Root of Truth. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The only sound was the frantic pounding of Selene's own blood in her ears. Damien lay broken before her, the life he possessed so forcefully just hours ago, now a faint flicker. The phantom agony in her own chest was a roaring fire, but seeing him, truly seeing the source of it, was 1,000 times worse. This was real. This was not a nightmare. He was dying. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her. But then something else rose to meet it. A lifetime of being dismissed, of being called useless, of hiding her true talents. It all burned away in a flash of pure, cold purpose. Shame had no place here. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. Right now, she was not the traitor's daughter. She was a healer, and he was her patient. She fell to her knees at his side, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that felt born of instinct. "Damien," she said, her voice sharp, trying to pull him back from the edge. His eyelids fluttered, but he didn't wake. His breathing was shallow, his skin deathly pale beneath a sheen of cold sweat. The wound in his side was deep, and the flesh around it was blackened, a telltale sign of advanced silver poisoning. It was eating him alive from the inside out. She tore open her healer's pouch, her mind racing through the pages of her secret journal. She remembered a sketch, a passage her mother had told her about in a hushed whisper long ago. A story about a rare root that could fight the silver's bite. Silverwood root. It was said to only grow in the shadows of ancient oaks, its properties a dangerous secret. It was a risk, a huge one. But it was his only chance. Her eyes scanned the ravine, and there, under the gnarled roots of a massive ancient oak tree, she saw it. A small, unassuming plant with dark green leaves and a faint silvery sheen. She scrambled over, digging into the damp earth with her bare hands until she held the gnarled root. It felt strangely warm to the touch. Working quickly, she crushed the root with a smooth stone, mixing it with the moss she scraped from the tree bark to form a thick, dark poultice. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. Every doubt she'd ever had about herself, every whisper of inadequacy, was gone. There was only this, only him. As she began to pack the pungent mixture into his wound, his eyes finally flickered open. They were hazy with pain, unfocused. He looked at her, but she wasn't sure he was truly seeing her. He was seeing a figure of fierce concentration, a woman covered in dirt and blood, working with a desperate, powerful grace. A low groan escaped his lips. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice soft but laced with steel. "You are not allowed to die." She worked tirelessly, cleaning the wound, applying the poultice, binding it tightly with strips of cloth torn from her own dress. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she felt the phantom fire in her own chest begin to recede. The raging inferno dwindled to a bearable burn. He was still unconscious, but his breathing was deepening, the rhythm growing stronger. He was alive. For now, it was enough. Exhausted and trembling, Selene sat back on her heels in the silent, bloody ravine, her vigil just beginning. Their bond had almost killed them both. But her secret, her power, it had just saved them. The game had changed forever. Chapter 13. A Fragile Trust. The first thing Damien became aware of was the scent of silverwood and crushed moss. The second was a profound, bone-deep weakness that felt utterly alien to him. He opened his eyes. He was not in the bloody ravine. He was back in the lodge, lying on the cot, and the dim light of dusk was filtering through the window. Selene was sitting in the chair beside him, her face pale and smudged with dirt. Her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fierce concentration as she ground herbs in a small stone bowl. She looked up, her fingers stilling as their eyes met. The frantic energy from the forest was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful calm. He was not her captor, not her enemy, but her patient. "You're awake," she stated, her voice soft, devoid of the anger he had come to expect. He tried to sit up, but a sharp, pulling pain in his side made him groan and fall back against the rough pillow. "Don't," she commanded, moving to his side. "The poultice is holding, but the silver is still in your blood. You need to be still." He looked at the bandage wrapped tightly around his torso, then back at her. He remembered flashes, agony, the taste of his own blood, and her. A whirlwind of focused energy, her hands working with impossible speed, her voice a steel command in the fog of his pain. "What you did," he started, his own voice a rough, gravelly sound. "That wasn't simple healing. The silver should have killed me." This was it. The moment she could lie, could deflect, could hide herself away again. But looking at him now, so utterly vulnerable, so completely at her mercy, the lies felt pointless. She had saved his life. That was a truth more powerful than any secret. She decided to trust him because he had seen her at her most powerful, and his eyes held not fear, but a raw, wondering awe. "My mother's line carries a gift," she admitted, the words feeling strange and heavy in the air. "An affinity for the earth. I can hear what the plants need, and sometimes what people do." He stared at her, 100 questions in his silver eyes. He had come to this pack to hunt traitors, to uncover a rot that threatened his entire territory. He had expected deceit, danger, and violence. He had never expected to find his fated mate. He had certainly never expected her to be a healer with a power that defied all logic, a woman who could single-handedly turn the tide against a poison that should have been his end. "You saved my life," he said, the words a solemn vow. "Why were they hunting you?" she asked, her own question a trade for the truth she had just offered. He hesitated for a long moment, the silence thick with secrets. "The ones who attacked me were not just hunters," he finally said, his voice low. "They were working with wolves from this pack, traitors. They are selling our secrets, our weaknesses. I came here to find them, to stop them." The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. Ria's probing questions, the blighted herbs. It was all connected, a conspiracy unfolding right under their noses. "Then we have to stop them," she said, her voice filled with a new, hard resolve. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the disgraced daughter or the timid apprentice, but a warrior, a queen. "Yes," he breathed, "we do." A new alliance, fragile and forged in blood and secrets, was born in the quiet of that room. Chapter 14. The Traitor's Pouch. In the 2 days that followed, a new kind of tension filled the lodge. It was the energy of a shared purpose, a secret that bound them closer than the mate bond itself. Damien was still weak, the silver's poison making him sleep more than he was awake, leaving the investigation in Selene's hands. She had to do this herself, because Damien was a stranger here, and she, the invisible girl, could move through the pack unnoticed. No one would ever suspect her of being a threat. It was the first time her outcast status had ever felt like an advantage. A weapon. Her target was Ria. Her plan was simple, and that was its strength. She would go to the main healing den, claiming she needed to replenish her personal stock of common feverfew. It was a plausible excuse, a normal task for an apprentice. While there, she would find a way to search Ria's belongings. She found the den empty, a small blessing from the spirits of the forest. The air inside was thick with the familiar smells of drying herbs, a scent that had once brought her comfort, but now felt charged with danger. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was foolish. This was reckless. But the image of Damien, pale and bleeding in the ravine, pushed her forward. Ria's personal effects were kept in a small satchel tucked beneath her cot, just as Selene knew they would be. Her fingers trembled as she unfastened the leather clasp. She felt like a thief, a betrayer, but she pushed the guilt down. Ria's betrayal had come first. Inside, she found the usual assortment of an apprentice's tools: a worn knife, bundled herbs, strips of clean linen. And then she saw it. Tucked into a side pocket was a small, tightly bound leather pouch. It was not pack issue. The leather was darker, stiffer, and it smelled faintly of something unfamiliar, something foreign. With a sense of impending dread, she pulled open the drawstring. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside was not one, but two damning pieces of evidence. The first was a gnarled, sickly-looking root. Its dark, twisted shape was unmistakable. It was the blighted silverwood root she had been finding at the edge of the territory, the very plant that held the key to both creating and curing the silver poison. But it was the second item that made her blood run cold. A small bundle of dried, grayish leaves tied with red string. She knew this herb. She had only ever seen it in the oldest, most forbidden texts in her mother's journal. It was called ghostbriar, a rare, potent plant used by the most elite hunters to completely mask their scent from a wolf's senses. There was only one reason a wolf would possess it: treason. She had it. The proof. A wave of triumphant, terrifying relief washed over her. The feeling was short-lived. Just as she was about to close the pouch, she heard footsteps outside the den, and voices. "I'm telling you, Kale, the stranger is getting stronger. We need to act now." It was Ria's voice, and she was not alone. Selene's heart leaped into her throat. She was trapped. Chapter 15. The Trap Springs. Panic, sharp and blinding, threatened to overwhelm Selene. Her mind raced. There was no back exit. The only way out was the door Ria and Kale were about to walk through. Her eyes darted around the small den, searching for any possible cover. A large storage cupboard, half hidden behind a rack of drying herbs, was her only option. It would have to be enough. She shoved the traitor's pouch back into Ria's satchel, slid it under the cot, and scrambled into the cupboard, pulling the heavy wooden door shut just as the den's main entrance creaked open. She peered through a thin crack in the wood, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they would hear it. Ria entered, followed closely by the arrogant, hulking form of Kale. His presence in the healing den was immediately jarring. He was a warrior, not a healer. He looked like a wolf in a sheep pen. "The Alpha King is still recovering," Ria said, her voice stripped of its usual feigned sweetness. It was cold, sharp, and impatient. "But he recovers too quickly. That healer girl, she did something. She countered the silver." "Alpha King?" Selene's mind reeled. "Damien? An Alpha King?" The revelation was a physical shock, another piece of the puzzle she never knew existed. "Then we need to get to her," Kale growled, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "The hunters are growing impatient. They want the girl. They say her bloodline is the key." "My bloodline." The words sent a chill of pure dread down Selene's spine. This was not just about Damien. This had always been about her. She was not just leverage. She was the prize. "And they will have her," Ria said smoothly. "But first, we use her to draw the king into the open one last time. A place where there are no escapes." Suddenly, Kale stopped. He sniffed the air, his head tilting. A predator sensing something amiss. "Something's different," he muttered, his eyes scanning the room. "It smells like fear." Ria scoffed. "This is a healing den. It always smells of fear and pain." But Kyle wasn't listening. His gaze swept over the room, lingering on the herb rack, and then on the cupboard behind it. Selene's blood turned to ice. He knew. He started walking toward her hiding place, his movements slow and deliberate. She was discovered. Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something. She held her breath, praying he would dismiss it, turn away. He reached the cupboard. His hand shot out and ripped the door open. For a moment, they just stared at each other. His eyes widened in shock, which quickly curdled into a triumphant, cruel smirk. "Well, well," he purred. "Look what we have here." Selene didn't hesitate. She threw a handful of dried, stinging nettle from a nearby bowl directly into his face. He roared in pain and surprise, clawing at his eyes. She used that split second to bolt, shoving past Rhea and lunging for the door. She almost made it. A hand tangled in her hair, yanking her back with brutal force. She cried out as she was slammed against the wall, her head striking the hard wood. Cale, his face already red and swelling, loomed over her, his eyes blazing with fury. "Big mistake, little healer." Before she could scream, a heavy, thick cloth was shoved over her mouth. The world swam in a sea of black spots, the cloying, sweet smell of a sleeping draft filling her senses. Her last conscious thought was of Damien's silver eyes as the darkness pulled her completely under. Chapter 16. The iron cage awareness returned to Selene not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal, jarring shock. A throbbing ache pulsed at the back of her skull, and a foul, sweet taste coated her tongue. The world swam into focus slowly, a smear of gray and black. The first thing she noticed was the smell. It was a horrifying cocktail of damp earth, stale blood, and the cold, metallic scent of fear. This was not the pack. This was a place of death. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. She was on a floor of cold, unforgiving stone. And she was enclosed. Thick, black iron bars surrounded her on all four sides. A cage. A primitive, brutal cage built for an animal. The sight of it, the sheer reality of her situation, finally pierced the fog in her mind, and a wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over her. She scrambled to her feet, her hands gripping the cold iron. "Hello?" she called out, her voice a weak, trembling thing. "Is anyone there?" Footsteps echoed in the darkness, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged from the shadows, holding a lantern. He was not a wolf. He was human, dressed in dark, reinforced leather, his face sharp and intelligent, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. He carried himself not like a brutish hunter, but like a scholar entering a library. He stopped just before her cage, his gaze analytical, assessing. "So, you are awake," he said, his voice calm, cultured. It was a terrifying contrast to the barbarity of her surroundings. "I am Marcus, and I have been waiting a very long time to meet someone from your mother's line." Selene stared at him, her mind reeling. "My mother's line? I don't know what you're talking about." A thin, humorless smile touched his lips. "Oh, I think you do. We know all about the women of the Marlowe family. We know about your gift." He leaned closer, the lantern light illuminating the chilling curiosity in his eyes. "A unique bloodline that allows you to not only heal your own kind, but to manipulate the life force of the very earth itself, to coax secrets from roots and poisons from flowers. A power like that, it is wasted on wolves." The casual way he spoke of her deepest secret, the one she barely understood herself, terrified her more than any threat of violence. This was not a random capture. It was a targeted acquisition. He saw her not as a person, but as a resource, an object to be studied and used. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her hands gripping the bars so tightly her knuckles were white. He set the lantern down on a nearby crate. "Want? I want to understand you. I want to unlock the potential your people have ignored for generations." His cold gaze swept over her. "And, of course, your presence here will serve as the perfect bait to draw out the so-called Alpha King your pack is harboring. He is a problem. You are the solution." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing until they faded into nothing, leaving her alone in the crushing darkness with the horrifying truth. She was not just bait. She was the prize. Chapter 17. A Viper's Smile. Sometime later, Selene couldn't tell if it had been hours or a day, the sound of footsteps returned. She tensed in the corner of her cage, expecting Marcus and his cold, analytical stare, but the figure who emerged from the shadows was horrifyingly familiar. It was Rhea. She wasn't a prisoner. She walked with an easy confidence, carrying a small bowl of water and a piece of dry bread. She looked like a friend coming to offer comfort. The sight of it made Selene's stomach turn. Rhea placed the meager offerings just outside the bars, her smile as sweet and cloying as the sleeping draft she'd used. "I thought you might be thirsty." Selene stared at her, the betrayal a raw, open wound. "Why?" she asked, the single word filled with the weight of 1,000 broken pieces of their shared past. Rhea's smile finally faltered, replaced by a look of unveiled contempt. The mask was off. "Why?" she scoffed, her voice dripping with years of barely concealed resentment. "Because I was tired of it, Selene. I was tired of watching you." "Watching me?" Selene whispered in disbelief. "Everyone ignored me. I was nothing." "Nothing?" Rhea let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You were never nothing. You were always the traitor's daughter, the tragic, special girl who everyone felt sorry for. Even when they hated you, they were still watching you." She began to pace in front of the cage, her movements agitated, her long-held poison finally spilling out. "I worked twice as hard as you in the den. My skills are perfect. My knowledge is precise. But Alara would still praise you when one of your little lucky remedies worked better than mine. You never even had to try. Things just came to you, that gift from your precious mother's bloodline." So she had known. All this time she had known, and she had hated her for it. Every kind word, every shared smile had been a lie. A carefully constructed facade hiding a core of pure, rotting jealousy. "And then he showed up," Rhea spat, her eyes flashing with a furious light. "The Alpha King, he didn't even look at anyone else. He saw you, the pathetic, disgraced girl, and claimed you in front of everyone. You, who have done nothing to deserve power, were handed everything, while I, who have planned and worked and bled for it, was still just an apprentice." She stopped pacing and looked at Selene, her expression a twisted mask of self-pity and rage. "I did this because I deserve what you were given by chance. The hunters will give me power. Kale will be the new Alpha with me as his Luna. And you? You will give them the secrets of your blood. It's a fair trade. You were never meant to lead. You were only ever meant to be a key." She turned without another word and walked away, leaving Selene alone in the dark. The physical cage around her was nothing compared to the prison of Rhea's betrayal. Every good memory she had of her only friend was now a lie, a cruel joke. The loneliness that washed over her was absolute. Chapter 18. The Last Ember. In the suffocating silence of the hunter's den, Selene finally broke. A dry, ragged sob tore from her throat, but no tears came. The pain was too deep for that. Rhea's words echoed in her mind, each one a fresh stab of betrayal. You were only ever meant to be a key. The pack had seen her as the traitor's daughter. The hunters saw her as a magical prize. And her best friend had only ever seen her as an obstacle. She was not a wolf, not a healer, not even a person anymore. She was a key, a prize, a tool. She curled into a ball on the cold stone floor, the iron bars a perfect cage for the animal she felt she had become. Hope was a distant memory, a flicker of light from another lifetime. What hope was there? Damien, an Alpha King, a truth that still felt impossible, was wounded, perhaps already dead. Even if he was alive, how could he possibly find her here? She was alone, stripped of her herbs, her freedom, her last remaining friendship. Everything she thought she knew about her life was a lie. Her past was a lie. Her future was a cage. This was her fate, then. To be used by Marcus until her secrets were drained. A tool for Rhea's ambition, a stepping stone for Kale's power. She was trapped, not just by iron bars, but by her own blood, by a legacy she had never asked for. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her, crushing the air from her lungs. It would be so easy to give up, to just let the darkness take her, to become the hollow, useless thing everyone had always believed her to be. She closed her eyes, a sense of resignation washing over her. But in the utter, complete darkness of her mind, a single, unexpected image appeared. A pair of startling silver eyes, blazing with a protective fury that had been entirely for her. "She's mine." The memory of his voice, a crack of thunder that had silenced the world. The feeling of his hand in hers, a brand of impossible strength. The memory of him in the ravine, broken and bleeding, and the surge of her own power rising to meet his weakness. He had called her strong. He had looked at her not as a traitor's daughter, but as a warrior. He had seen the fire she tried so hard to hide. Ria's voice echoed again. "You were never meant to lead." A new feeling, hot and sharp, pierced through the cold blanket of her despair. It was not hope. It was something harder, something colder. It was rage, pure, undiluted rage. They were all wrong. The pack was wrong. The hunters were wrong. And Ria, the viper who had pretended to be her friend, was the most wrong of all. Selene's eyes snapped open in the darkness. The despair was still there, a cold stone in her gut. But now, a single hot ember of defiance was glowing within it. They thought she was a key? Fine. She would be a key, the key that unlocked their destruction. They thought she was a prize? They would soon learn the price of claiming her. She was Selene Marlowe, and she was done being a victim. Her fight was not over. It had just begun. Chapter 19. An Unseen Weapon. In the depths of the hunter's den, the ember of Selene's rage did not burn out. It smoldered, a secret heat in the crushing cold, and with it, her mind began to work. She was a healer. A healer's greatest tool was not a knife or a claw, but observation. And so, she began to watch. Her cage was no longer a prison. It was a vantage point. She stopped seeing the bars and started seeing the patterns between them. She learned the guards' routines. There were 3 of them who rotated shifts. A large, brutish man who was lazy, a younger one who was nervous, and a third who was arrogant and cruel. The lazy one, Boren, often left her food tray just within arm's reach for too long. The nervous one, Finn, refused to look her in the eye. The cruel one, Yorick, liked to mock her through the bars. They were all careless. They were all sloppy because she was just a helpless girl in a cage. They saw her as a prize, an object, and had completely forgotten that objects can have sharp edges. Her gaze shifted from the guards to the den itself. It was a hastily repurposed cave system, damp and poorly ventilated. In the darkest, wettest corner of the main cavern, just visible from her cell, a patch of sickly-looking fungi grew. It was a pale, ghostly white, and the stone around it was stained with a black, slimy residue. She recognized the signs. It was a symptom of a contaminated water source, a sickness in the very rock. Her healer's mind, the part of her that understood the secret workings of rot and decay, shifted from healing to toxicology. A plan, cold and sharp and dangerous, began to form. It was a desperate gamble, a whisper of a chance, but it was hers. She would not be a passive prize waiting to be claimed or rescued. She would not be a key used to unlock someone else's victory. If she was a weapon, she would be the one to aim it. She would sharpen her mind into a blade. She would turn her knowledge of healing into a vector for sickness. She would make them weak from the inside out, poisoning the very water they drank. This was her turning point, a promise she made to herself in the suffocating darkness. She would not be a victim, not be a prize, not be a footnote in someone else's story. They wanted to see the power in her bloodline? Fine, she would show them. She would show them what happens when you cage something that knows how to rot you from the core. The first glimmer of a new kind of hope, a hope forged not of rescue but of rebellion, began to burn away the despair. The huntress was about to become the plague. Chapter 20. A weaver's gambit. The opportunity came, as she knew it would, with the lazy guard. Boren brought her evening meal, a stale piece of bread and a skin of water, and set the wooden tray on the floor. He was distracted, laughing with Jorik a few yards away, and left the tray just inches from the bars. Close enough. Selene's heart began to beat a slow, steady rhythm of cold resolve. Her hands were not bound. It was another oversight, another sign of their arrogance. She carefully pulled a long, strong thread from the hem of her worn tunic. It was a painstaking process, her fingers working silently in the dim light. She looped the thread, creating a small, effective lasso. This was a new kind of remedy, a new kind of healing. She was healing herself from the helplessness that had plagued her for years. Lying on her side, pretending to be asleep, she extended her arm through the bars. The thread snaked out, a thin, dark line against the damp stone. Her target was not the food. It was the small patch of moss and fungi just beyond the tray. The spores from the ghost cap fungi, she knew, were not lethal in small doses, but they were a potent neurotoxin. They caused confusion, nausea, and crippling muscle weakness. It would be like a sickness sweeping through the den. Her first attempt failed, the thread falling short. She pulled it back, her breath held tight in her chest. The second time, the loop settled perfectly over a small clump of the pale fungus. She tightened it gently and pulled. A small piece, no bigger than her thumbnail, broke free and skittered across the floor toward her. She quickly snatched it, her hand retreating into the shadows of her cage just as Boren turned back. He grunted, picked up the tray, and walked away, completely oblivious. She had the poison. Now she needed to deliver it. She waited. Hours later, when the nervous guard, Finn, was on duty, she saw her chance. He was tasked with refilling the main water barrel that served the guards. He left it uncovered for a mere 30 seconds as he went to speak with another hunter. It was now or never. Selene crumbled the fungus into a fine, almost invisible powder. She crept to the bars and, with a deep breath, blew the dust from her palm. The small cloud drifted on the damp air, invisible in the gloom, and settled on the surface of the water. Her work was not done. She had created chaos, but she needed to send out a sign of hope. She took a piece of straw from her thin bedding and with nimble fingers began to weave it. She remembered her mother teaching her a specific knot, a complex weave that healers of the old lines used as a distress signal. A weaver's knot. A silent scream for help that only those who knew the old ways would recognize. She finished the small, intricate symbol and placed it in her empty water skin, leaving it by the bars. It was a desperate prayer sent out into the darkness. A hope that somewhere, somehow, the one wolf bound to her soul was close enough to find it. Chapter 21. The Coming Storm. The waiting was a special kind of torture. Selene sat in her cage, a coiled spring of terror and anticipation. Did it work? Was the dose enough? Or had she just condemned herself for nothing? For hours, the only sounds were the familiar, mundane noises of the den. The crackle of a distant fire, the murmur of voices, the drip of water. She was starting to lose hope, a cold dread seeping back into her bones. Then, she heard the first cough. It was a wet, hacking sound from one of the guards, quickly stifled. A few minutes later, another hunter stumbled, catching himself against the wall with a groan. The poison was working. Slowly, subtly, the sickness was spreading. The murmurs of conversation turned into grunts of discomfort. A sense of confusion began to ripple through the hunters. Jorik, the cruel guard, started shouting at the others for being lazy, his voice strained. The disciplined quiet of the den was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by an undercurrent of sickness and irritation. Marcus appeared, his face a mask of cold fury. He saw the state of his men, some leaning against walls, others pale and sweating, and knew instantly that this was not a natural illness. His sharp, intelligent eyes swept the cavern and landed, with chilling certainty, on Selene's cage. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew she was the cause. Just as he started to stride toward her, Selene felt it. It was not a sound. It was a feeling, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very stone beneath her. The silver thread of the bond, which had been a dull, distant ache, suddenly flared to life. It was a roaring, white-hot conduit of pure, undiluted rage. He was here. He was close. The fury she felt pouring through the bond was not her own. It was his. It was the righteous, terrifying anger of an alpha king coming to reclaim what was his. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through her fear. Marcus must have felt the shift in the air, too. The primal energy of a powerful wolf on the verge of attack. The den was in chaos. His men were weak. He was being assaulted from within and without. His cold composure finally broke, replaced by a snarl of desperate fury. He lunged toward her cage, unlocking it with a key from his belt. "You think you've won, little witch?" he snarled, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. "You are still my shield." He dragged her out of the cage, pulling her in front of him, a cold blade pressing against her throat. Her plan had worked, but it had also made her the most valuable and vulnerable person in the room. The groans and coughs of the sick hunters were suddenly drowned out by a sound that shook the entire cavern. Boom! The heavy, iron-reinforced doors to the den splintered, exploding inward in a shower of wood and metal. A silhouette stood in the opening, a figure of pure, untamed power against the night sky. The final battle had just begun. Chapter 22, Claws and Cunning. In the instant the doors shattered, the world exploded into a symphony of violence. Damien was not just a wolf. He was a storm given form, a blur of shadow and fury that crashed into the weakened hunters. His warriors, howling with a battle cry that shook the very stone, poured in behind him. The den, which had been a place of quiet sickness and tension, became a whirlwind of snarling chaos and the sharp, bright clang of steel. Marcus shoved Selene forward, the cold edge of his blade still pressed tight against her skin. "Stay back!" he roared, his voice thin with panic over the din of the fight. "Or the girl dies!" Damien, his silver eyes blazing with a feral light, froze mid-lunge. His gaze locked on the blade at Selene's throat, and for a heart-stopping second, the battle around them seemed to fade into a distant roar. He was trapped. But Selene was not. She was no longer the frightened girl from the ceremony. She was a survivor, a strategist, a healer who knew every weakness in the body. With a surge of adrenaline, she stomped her heel down, hard, on the delicate bones of Marcus's instep. He roared in pain, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She slammed her head back into his nose with a sickening crunch. He staggered, his hold on her completely broken. She didn't run. She fought. She scooped up a handful of dust and rock from the filthy floor and flung it at his eyes, blinding him. "Now, Damien!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. It was the only signal he needed. The fight was no longer a rescue. It was a coordinated attack. They fought not as two individuals, but as one heart, one mind, one purpose. He was the unstoppable force, a whirlwind of claws and teeth that tore through the disoriented hunters. She was the immovable object, using her knowledge and her environment with a deadly cunning. She pointed out weaknesses in the hunter's armor she had observed from her cage. She kicked a barrel of oil into the fire to create a wall of smoke and confusion. She pressed a specific nerve cluster in Cale's neck as he tried to flee, making his arm go limp and useless. The battle was short and brutal. The hunters, already weakened by her poison and facing the full fury of an alpha king, stood no chance. Soon the last of them had fallen or surrendered. The den fell quiet, the only sounds the panting of wolves and the groans of the defeated. In the center of the carnage stood Damien and Selene, and at their feet, bound and bleeding, were Marcus, Cale, and a trembling, defeated Rhea. The war for Selene's freedom was over. Chapter 23, The King and His Queen. The aftermath of the battle was a space of ringing silence. The air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and victory. Damien's warriors, their forms shifting back from the primal fury of the fight, stared at him with a new, profound awe. The raw power of the Alpha King was undeniable, a palpable force in the cavern. But Damien's attention was not on his victory. It was not on his men. It was only on her. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, his silver eyes scanning every inch of her, searching for injuries. His hands came up to gently cup her face, his thumbs wiping away a smear of dirt from her cheek. The touch was so tender, so full of a desperate relief, it almost brought her to her knees. He was the victor, the king, the conqueror. But in his eyes, she saw only a man who had been terrified of losing her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, rough whisper that was meant for her alone. She shook her head, unable to find her own voice. A single tear, hot and cleansing, traced a path through the grime on her face. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the tremors that still racked her body, but he also saw the unyielding strength that had saved them both. He saw the healer, the strategist, the survivor. He saw the woman who had fought back from the inside while he fought from the outside. And in front of his warriors, in front of the bound and defeated traitors, he did something that no Alpha King had done in 1,000 years. He sank to one knee. He bowed his head, a king submitting to a power greater than his own. He took her hand, the one that had mixed poisons and healed wounds, and pressed it to his forehead. A collective gasp went through the room. It was an act of ultimate fealty, an offering of absolute vulnerability. "They were wrong," he said, his voice thick with an emotion so raw it made her heart ache. His silver eyes looked up at her, stripped of all pride, all arrogance. All that was left was a man laid bare. "You were never a key. You are the kingdom." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening. "Not just my mate," he vowed, his voice shaking with the weight of the words. "My queen. I am yours to command, Selene. Mark me. Choose me." He was giving her the ultimate choice, the final say. He was not claiming her. He was asking to be claimed by her. In that moment, she was not the disgraced daughter, the unwanted girl, or the healer's apprentice. She was a force of nature being worshipped by a storm, and the entire world held its breath waiting for her answer. Chapter 24. A Legacy of Moonlight. Their return to the Silver Moon Pack was not a quiet one. It was a procession. Damien, his true identity as the Alpha King of the neighboring Black Mountain Pack now revealed, walked with a commanding presence. But he did not walk in front. He walked beside Selene, their hands clasped, a silent declaration to all that they were equals. His warriors followed with the bound traitors, Kale, Rhea, and their few co-conspirators, shoved before them. They marched directly to the great clearing, the site of the ceremony that had started everything. The pack gathered, their faces a mixture of confusion, fear, and astonishment. The Alpha of Silver Moon met them, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the legendary Alpha King in his territory. The truth was laid bare. Damien spoke of the treason, of the alliance with hunters that had threatened them all. He spoke of Selene's capture, and then, his voice ringing with a pride that made her chest swell, he spoke of her cunning, her bravery, her power. He told them how she had weakened the enemy from within, how she had fought, how she had been the architect of their victory. The traitors were brought forward. Rhea, her face pale with terror, refused to look at Selene. Kyle, however, lifted his head, his gaze finding Selene in the crowd. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated understanding. "You were never weak," he whispered, the words barely audible, a final admission of his own blindness. "You were just quiet." The pack's justice was swift. The traitors were exiled, their marks of the pack seared from their skin, a fate worse than death. Then a strange thing happened. One by one, the wolves who had once whispered about her, who had sneered at her, who had looked through her as if she were a ghost, they lowered their heads. Then they knelt. They were not kneeling to the visiting Alpha King. They were kneeling to her. to the healer who had saved them, to the woman who had faced their greatest enemies and won. Selene stood tall, the ghosts of her past finally banished by the respect of her present. She looked at Damien, and in his silver eyes, she saw her future. A future of strength, of partnership, of a love forged in fire and truth. She raised his hand to her lips, and then, in front of the two united packs, she accepted his offer. She marked him. Not as a possessive act, but as a promise. He marked her in return, the bond between them searing into a brilliant final form, a perfect circle of choice and fate. The disgraced daughter was gone forever. In her place stood a Luna Queen, her legacy not one of shame, but one forged in moonlight and courage.